Was St. Paul a liar? And did he replace Jeshua's message with his Pharisee beliefs? Hey guys, it's John sitting here in the studio with a fabulous mug of John's Joe coffee. So, Paul, let's talk about Paul. Paul is a very interesting thing. If Paul never walked with Jesus, why does most of Christianity follow his teachings instead of the people who actually supposedly did walk with Joshua? But what if I told you Paul wasn't just confused? He may have been the false teacher warned about in early texts. So let's talk about that. Paul never met Joshua in life. Neither did Luke or Timothy, because Luke and Timothy were the disciples of Paul. Luke and Paul are 50% of the New Testament, and it's very interesting because his teachings are highly in contrast with what Joshua supposedly taught in the rest of the Bible. In fact, Paul himself was a Pharisee. Don't take my word for it, take Paul's word for it. In the Bible, he literally says, "I'm a Pharisee and the son of a Pharisee." He also never anywhere in the Bible gives up his Pharisaic beliefs. The concept is interesting. And I want you to understand, this is not an attack on faith. This is a return to true teachings of love, truth, and spiritual power that Joshua talked about. This channel is about awakening and reclaiming spirituality, the individual divinity within yourself, from the dogma it's been buried under. The modern church is more Pauline than Christian-centered. And this video is about setting your belief free. And belief and faith are interchangeable. In Christianity, they'll tell you that faith means faith in Jesus. But he never said that. He literally said the kingdom of heaven was within you. You didn't need faith in something outside of yourself to connect to that God that's within you. He spoke of fearlessly being present and returning to that love that's within you. As I said, Paul was a proud Pharisee. He never left the roots. He according to the strictest sect of the religion, he lived as a Pharisee. That's from the book of Acts. The Pharisees were obsessed with laws, external laws, sin, consciousness, ritual purity, and status. They were an authority figure. They were a group that was trying to literally interject rules and laws on the people around them. They were the Taliban. Paul, in his writings, brought all of that stuff back, but under a new name. Instead of freeing people from religious fear, Paul rebranded it in Jeshua's name. As I said earlier, Paul never knew Jesus personally. And in the book of Galatians, he claims that his gospel comes from revelation, not from Jesus's earthly followers. So in other words, he didn't get any information from the people who were walking with Jesus, but all of his information came from revelation, from this divine stuff that came through him, this awareness of himself. Apostles like James or Peter were appointed by Joshua according to the Bible, but Paul is the one who's self-appointed. He's the one who said, "I am the apostle of the Gentiles." No one said he was an apostle except for Paul. And he self-appointed it supposedly after a vision on the road to Damascus, which he himself says is true. No one else said, "I saw Paul have a vision. I was there when Paul woke and enlightened." No one ever says that, because everything that Paul says is only validated by Paul's own word. So let me ask you a question. Would you trust a guy who rewrote the manual when he never met the author? 1975, Sandra Butler decided to study the Recognitions of Clement, rejected by the church, but preserved elsewhere. So other people were actually looking at the Recognitions of Clement, but the church denied its validity. These early writings warn of a man who clouds the true message. In fact, the actual quote is, "enormous smoke preventing seeing the founder aright." They say this man caused James the just to be thrown down temple steps. This person who was literally throwing up smoke and preventing seeing the founder, Jeshua, outright, had James thrown down the temple steps. Many scholars widely believe this is a reference to Paul. In the Gnostic text, James calls Paul the liar. Multiple ancient sources describe Paul as a self-authorized, divisive, and not approved by the 12. Many ancient sources say this. But let's look at what Paul interjected that was so offensive to other people who were teaching the way. So let's look at what people who were teaching the way Jeshua taught, or teaching what Jeshua taught. Let's see what they were offended by. Let's see what things were added to the text. Paul's Pharisee background threw a whole bunch of things into the teachings that Jeshua never says. It's all Paul's teachings. And remember, 50% of the New Testament is Paul's teachings. Luke was parroting Paul. So because Luke was Paul's disciple, he never met Jeshua either. Let's talk about the first one, original sin and blood atonement. Paul introduced inherited guilt from Adam. That's in the book of Romans. He teaches salvation comes through that blood sacrifice, that going to the cross was a blood sacrifice. This is a Pharisaic belief. Jeshua didn't say that it was a blood sacrifice. Nobody else said it was a blood sacrifice. Paul said it was a blood sacrifice. Jeshua taught about love and presence. He healed people through compassion. Paul says your salvation requires a death. He says you have to have a blood sacrifice. This is literally a Pharisaic belief. The Pharisees were very much into apocalyptic urgency. In the book of Corinthians, the time is short, the world is passing away. These end time prophecies that were not only the Pharisees, but the Essenes had the same thing. They were apocalyptic preachers too. They had these end time expectations were not anything Jeshua taught. Think not upon tomorrow, be here today. Well, thinking not upon tomorrow means there is no fate, destiny, or pre-planned ending ahead of us. So Jeshua said the kingdom was within, not in a future cataclysm. Paul interjects celibacy and anti-marriage sentiment. He literally said that all Christians should be celibate. And the reason he said this is because the end times are coming. Having children would be cruel. It makes no sense to have children if the end times are coming. And in the book of Corinthians, Paul literally says it's better not to touch a woman and wishes all were celibate like him. This concept of celibacy and that those purity laws, these come from the Pharisees and from the Essenes, but not Joshua. He never says those things. In the Bible, the first miracle is at a wedding, the wedding of Cana, and he never condemned love or sexuality. Those were Paul's teachings. Those were from the teachings directly coming out of the Pharisee teachings. And now, a quick word from our sponsor. Coffee Time with John. This channel runs off coffee, so get your coffee and tea at johnsjoe.com. In the Bible, there's many confrontations. The book of Galatians, Paul confronts Peter, and there was Acts 15 says there were disputes between Paul and the Jerusalem leadership. It says this in the Bible, that Paul was at odds with the rest of the disciples. James emphasized ethics and works. Faith without works is dead. Paul literally says, by faith alone are you saved, not by works. It's completely antithetical to what James was saying, Jeshua said, and James was his brother. All of this is not a theological footnote. It's spiritual mutiny. Paul is literally overthrowing the teachings and interjecting his Pharisee beliefs. Why does all this matter today? Modern Christianity's focus on guilt, fear, and unworthiness comes from Paul, not Jeshua. The church chose control and sin and hierarchy and obedience. Jeshua taught love your neighbor. The kingdom is within. You are the light of the world. If you've ever felt that religion made you feel small, insignificant, unworthy, it wasn't Jeshua talking. It was Paul talking. It was the Pharisee beliefs of Paul talking. On this channel, John of New, I don't follow Paul. I follow love. Everything to me is about being love. John the beloved, John be love, right? Be love. Love is the ultimate. Love is the eternal. Love is the infinite. And all the rest are just fog. All the rest are just these mires of man's trying to control God, like the Pharisees try to control God through fear. Well, that's what the apocalyptic teachings were. They're teaching you to fear a future so that you'll fall in line with their beliefs. Well, guess what? You are not fallen. You don't need to be saved from your humanity. Joshua's message wasn't about dying for you. It was about waking you up. It was about bringing you back to the divinity within yourself. Greater works than I have done, you will do. It is your faith that heals you. You can ask mountains to move, and it'll move. Nothing's impossible for you. Anyone who teaches fear and shame in God's name might just be the false teacher the early followers warned us about. But you don't have to believe me. You're allowed to question everything. The church will tell you you're not. You're not allowed to question because the church is leaning into the teachings of Paul and Luke and Timothy and these Pharisees. But Jesus himself took down the Pharisees. Shame on you, Pharisees, is in the Bible. Don't take what I'm saying on faith. Take it into your heart. Start to understand that you have the ability to live into this idea of what Yeshua actually taught, which was love, compassion, presence, fearlessness. So was Paul misunderstood, or was he the great detour? The question is why would the church lean into Paul when he wasn't one of the 12? And so, my friends, understand the Bible is filled with detours and control mechanisms. And people will often lean into this control thing, and they'll start getting mad about the control of the church and all that stuff. It doesn't matter what happened yesterday. It only matters who you are today, in the now. Awaken to your divinity that Jeshua taught. Awaken to being present like Jeshua taught. Awaken to loving your neighbors, no matter who they are. Your neighbors are not of the same faith. They are not of the same gender. They are not of the same religion. They are other people in the world, no matter what they believe. Love your neighbors. Jeshua spoke to Samaritans. He talked to Romans. He talked to everybody, right? But he did call out the Pharisees specifically for literally disempowering people. That's what he was talking about. These rules and laws and regulations are not of God. They're of man and trying to create power. And Paul was a self-proclaimed Pharisee. And Paul never set that down. And that's my thought on this. You guys have a great day, and I'll talk to you soon. See you. Bye.